It's 2017 and Old Time Radio DVD is still here. Check out our new customer ownership program and the lowest prices ever. Just go to oldtimeradiodvd.com for full information about this wonderful program. Don't forget our new program, 123 Ready TV. Folks, this is really a great app for Android and Windows phones, computers, and tablets. And it's only $19.99. In the near future, we will be adding a new component to it, Old Time Radio. It's a great product for 2017. Visit oldtimeradiodvd.com today. Place your order. You'll be glad you did.
It would be where no man could breathe at all. But even while he thought of this, he took note that those jagged peaks blazing in sunlight against an almost black sky were level with him. He was no longer ascending. The road ran on before him in a kind of shallow ravine, bounded on his left by the tops of the highest rock pinnacles, and on his right by a smooth ascending swell of stone that ran up to the true Harandra. And where he was, he could still breathe, though gasping, dizzy, and in pain. The blaze in his eyes was worse. The sun was setting. The Harassa must have foreseen this. They could not live, any more than he, on the Harandra by night. Still staggering forward, he looked about him for any sign of Augre's tower, whatever Augre might be. Doubtless Ransom exaggerated the time during which he thus wandered and watched the shadows from the rocks lengthening towards him. It cannot really have been long before he saw a light ahead, a light which showed how dark the surrounding landscape had become. He tried to run, but his body would not respond. Stumbling in haste and weakness, he made for the light, thought he had reached it, and found that it was far farther off than he had supposed. Almost despaired, staggered on again, and came at last to what seemed a cavern mouth. The light within was an unsteady one, and a delicious wave of warmth smote on his face. It was firelight. Ransom came into the mouth of the cave, and then unsteadily round the fire into the interior, and stood still, blinking in the light. When at last he could see, he discerned a smooth chamber of green rock, very lofty. There were two things in it. One of them, dancing on the wall and roof, was the huge, angular shadow of a Sawn. The other, crouching beneath it, was the Sawn himself.
"Come in, small one," boomed the Sawn. "Come in and let me look at you."
"The Harassa have sent me to look for Oyasa," Ransom said. His voice sounded to him a shrill treble. The Sawn peered at him.
"You are not from this world," it said suddenly.
"No," replied Ransom, and sat down. He was too tired to explain.
"I think you are from Thalcandra, small one," said the Sawn.
"Why?" said Ransom.
"You are small and thick, and that is how the animals ought to be made in the heavier world. You cannot come from Glandandra, for it is so heavy that if any animals could live there, they would be flat like plates. Even you, small one, would break if you stood up on that world. I do not think you are from Perillandra, for it must be very hot. If any came from there, they would not live when they arrived here. So I conclude you are from Thalcandra." "The world I come from is called Earth by those who live there," said Ransom, "and it is much warmer than this. Before I came into your cave, I was nearly dead with cold and thin air." The Sawn made a sudden movement with one of its long forelimbs. Ransom stiffened, though he did not allow himself to retreat. The creature might be going to grab him. In fact, his intentions were kindly. Stretching back into the cave, it took from the wall what looked like a cup. Then Ransom saw that it was attached to a length of flexible tube. The Sawn put it into his hands. "Smell on this," it said. "The Harassa also need it when they pass this way."
Ransom inhaled and was instantly refreshed. His painful shortness of breath was eased, and the tension of chest and temples was relaxed. The Sawn of the lighted cavern, hitherto vague and dreamlike to his eyes, took on a new reality. "Oxygen?" he asked, but naturally the English word meant nothing to the Sawn. "Are you called Augre?" Ransom asked.
"Yes," said the Sawn. "What are you called?" The animal I am called is man, and therefore the Harossa call me Haman. But my own name is Ransom.
Man. Rensum, said the Thorn.
Ransom noticed that it spoke differently from the Harossa, without any suggestion of their persistent initial H. The Thorn was sitting on its long, wedge-shaped buttocks, with its feet drawn close up to it. A man in the same posture would have rested his chin on his knees, but the Thorn's legs were too long for that. Its knees rose high above its shoulders on each side of its head, grotesquely suggestive of huge ears, and the head, down between them, rested its chin on the protruding breast. The creature seemed to have either a double chin or a beard. Ransom could not make out which in the firelight. It was mainly white or cream in colour, and seemed to be clothed down to the ankles in some soft substance that reflected the light. On the long, fragile shanks, where the creature was closest to him, Ransom saw that this was some natural kind of coat. It was not like fur, but more like feathers. In fact, it was almost exactly like feathers. The whole animal, seen at close quarters, was less terrifying than he had expected, and even a little smaller. The face, it was true, took a good deal of getting used to. It was too long, too solemn, and too colourless. And it was much more unpleasantly like a human face than any inhuman creature's face ought to be. His eyes, like those of all very large creatures, seemed too small for it. But it was more grotesque than horrible. A new conception of the Thorns began to arise in Ransom's mind. The ideas of giant and ghost receded behind those of goblin and gawk.
Perhaps you are hungry, small one, it said.
Ransom was. The Thorn rose with strange spidery movements and began going to and fro about the cave, attended by its thin goblin shadow. It brought him the usual vegetable foods of Malacandra, and strong drink with the very welcome addition of a smooth, brown substance which revealed itself to nose, eye, and palate, in defiance of all probability, as cheese. Ransom asked what it was. The Thorn began to explain painfully how the female of some animals secreted a fluid for the nourishment of its young, and would have gone on to describe the whole process of milking and cheese-making if Ransom had not interrupted it. Yes, he said, we do the same on Earth. But tell me, he said, do you rule the Harossa?
Oyasa rules them.
And who rules you?
Oyasa.
And is he a Thorn?
No, small one. I have told you he rules all now.
So he pronounced Hanau.
And everything in Malacandra.
I do not understand this, Oyasa, said Ransom. Tell me more.
Oyasa does not die, said the Thorn, and he does not breed. He is the one of his kind who was put into Malacandra to rule it when Malacandra was made. His body is not like ours, nor yours. It is hard to see, and the light goes through it.
Like an Eldil?
Yes, he is the greatest of Eldilla who ever came to Ahandra.
What are these Eldilla? Have they no bodies?
Of course they have bodies. There are a great many bodies you cannot see. To us, the Eldil is a thin, half-real body that can go through walls and rocks. To himself he goes through them because he is solid and firm, and they are like cloud. And what is true light to him, and fills the heavens so that he will plunge into the rays of the sun to refresh himself from it, is to us the black nothing in the sky at night. These things are not strange, small one, though they are beyond our senses. But it is strange that the Eldilla never visit Thalcandra.
Of that I am not certain, said Ransom. Why does Oyasa send for me? He asked.
Oyasa has not told me, said the Thorn, but doubtless he would want to see any stranger from another Handra.
We have no Oyasa in my world, said Ransom.
That is another proof, said the Thorn, that you come from Thalcandra, the silent planet.
What has that to do with it? The Thorn seemed surprised.
It is not very likely, if you had an Oyasa, that he would never speak to ours.
Speak to yours? But how could he? It is millions of miles away.
Oyasa would not think of it like that.
you mean that he ordinarily receives messages from other planets?
Oyasa would not say that he lives on Malacandra and that another Oyasa lives on another Earth. For him, Malacandra is only a place in the heavens. It is in the heavens that he and the others live. Of course they talk together.
Ransom's mind shied away from the problem. He was getting sleepy and thought he must be misunderstanding the Thorn. I think I must sleep, Orgray, he said. And I do not know what you are saying. Perhaps, too, I do not come from what you call Falcandra.
We will both sleep presently, said the Thorn. But first, I will show you Falcandra.
It rose, and Ransom followed it into the back of the cave. Here he found a little recess, and running up within it a winding stair. The steps, hewn for Thorns, were too high for a man to climb with any comfort, but using hands and knees he managed to hobble up. The Thorn preceded him. Ransom did not understand the light which seemed to come from some small round object which the creature held in its hand. They went up a long way, almost as if they were climbing up the inside of a hollow mountain. At last, breathless, he found himself in a dark but warm chamber of rock, and heard the Thorn saying,
She is still well above the southern horizon.
It directed Ransom's attention to something like a small window. Whatever it was, it did not appear to work like an earthly telescope, Ransom thought, though an attempt made next day to explain the principles of the telescope to the Thorn threw grave doubts on his own ability to discern the difference. He leaned forward with his elbows on the sill of the aperture and looked. He saw perfect blackness, and floating in the center of it, seemingly an arm's length away, a bright disk about the size of a half-crown. Most of its surface was featureless, shining silver. Towards the bottom, markings appeared, and below them a white cap, just as he had seen the polar caps in astronomical photographs of Mars. He wondered for a moment if it was Mars he was looking at. Then, as his eyes took in the markings better, he recognized what they were. Northern Europe and a piece of North America. They were upside down, and the North Pole at the bottom of the picture, and this somehow shocked him. But it was Earth he was seeing, even perhaps England, though the picture shook a little and his eyes were quickly getting tired, and he could not be certain that he was not imagining it. It was all there in that little disk. London, Athens, Jerusalem, Shakespeare. There everyone had lived and everything had happened. And there, presumably, the pack he had been carrying was still lying in the porch of an empty house near Stirk. Yes, he said dully to the Thorn. That is my world. It was the bleakest moment in all his travels. Of Malacandra, the Harandra, with the vague feeling that a great weight had been taken off his mind. Then he remembered that he was the guest of a Thorn, and that the creature he had been avoiding ever since he landed had turned out to be as amicable as the Harossa, though he was far from feeling the same affection for it. Nothing then remained to be afraid of in Malacandra except Oyasa. The last fence, thought Ransom. Orgray the Thorn gave him food and drink. And now, said Ransom, how shall I find my way to Oyasa?
I will carry you, said the Thorn. You are too small a one to make the journey yourself, and I will gladly go to Meldalorn.
He showed Ransom a flask with a tube attached to it, and at the end of the tube a cup, obviously an apparatus for administering oxygen to oneself.
Smell on it as you have need, small one, said the Thorn, and close it up when you do not.
Orgray fastened the thing on his back and gave the tube over his shoulder into his hand. Ransom could not restrain a shudder at the touch of the Thorn's hands upon his body. They were fan-shaped, 7-fingered, mere skin over bone like a bird's leg, and quite cold. To divert his mind from such reactions, he asked where the apparatus was made, for he had not as yet seen anything remotely like a factory or a laboratory.
We thought it, said the Thorn, and the Pfiffeltriggy made it. Why do they make them? Said Ransom. He was trying once more with insufficient vocabulary to find out the political and economic framework of Malacandrian life.
They like making these things, said Orgray. It is true they like best the making of things that are only good to look at and of no use. But sometimes, when they are tired of that, they will make things for us, things we have thought, provided they are difficult enough. But let us begin our journey. You shall sit on my shoulder.
The proposal was unexpected and alarming, but seeing that the Sorn had already crouched down, Ransom felt obliged to climb onto the plume-like surface of its shoulder to seat himself beside the long, pale face, casting his right arm as far as it would go round the huge neck, and to compose himself, as well as he could, for his precarious mode of travel. The giant rose cautiously to a standing position, and Ransom found himself looking down on the landscape from a height of about 18 feet.
Is all well, small one? The Sorn asked.
Very well, Ransom answered, and the journey began. It was, Ransom thought, like riding an elephant at the zoo in boyhood, like riding on his father's back at a still earlier age. It was fun. They seemed to be doing between 6 and 7 miles an hour. The cold, though severe, was endurable, and thanks to the oxygen, he had little difficulty with his breathing. The landscape which he saw from his high, swaying post of observation was a solemn one. Over the edge of the valley, as it had frothed down from the true Harandra, came great curves of the rose-tinted cumular stuff which he had so often seen from a distance. Now, on a nearer view, they appeared hard as stone in substance, but puffed above and stalked beneath like vegetation. His original simile of giant cauliflower turned out to be surprisingly correct. Stone cauliflowers, the size of cathedrals and the colour of pale rose. He asked the Sorn what it was.
It is the old forests of Malacandra, said Orgray. Once there was air on the Harandra, and it was warm. To this day, if you could get up there and live, you would see it all covered with the bones of ancient creatures. They were covered not with fur, but with a coat like mine. They did not go in the water swimming or on the ground walking. They glided in the air on broad, flat limbs which kept them up. It is said they were great singers, and in those days the red forests echoed with their music.
We still have such creatures in our world, said Ransom. We call them birds. Where was Oyasa when all this happened to the Harandra?
Where he is now.
And could he not prevent it?
I do not know. But a world is not made to last forever, much less a race. That is not Malaldil's way.
As they proceeded, they passed many caves where, as Orgray told him, Sorns lived. Sometimes a high cliff would be perforated with countless holes to the very top, and unidentifiable noises came from within. Work was in progress at the Sorn, but of what kind it could not make Ransom understand. Only towards afternoon, as they were about to descend into a dip of the road, they met 3 Sorns together, coming towards them down the opposite slope. They seemed to Ransom to be rather skating than walking. The grace of their movement, their lofty stature, and the softened glancing of the sunlight on their feathery sides effected a final transformation in Ransom's feelings towards their race. Ogres, he had called them when they first met his eyes as he struggled in the grip of Weston and Devine. Titans, or angels, he now thought would have been a better word. In spite of the cold, which made him often dismount and take a spell on foot, he did not wish for the end of the journey. But Orgray had his own plans, and halted for the night long before sundown at the home of an older Sorn. Ransom saw well enough that he was brought there to be shown to a great scientist. Their host in these caverns was attended by a number of other Sorns who seemed to be in some way subordinate to him. Ransom thought at first that they were servants, but decided later that they were pupils or assistants. The evening's conversation was not such as would interest a terrestrial listener, for the Sorns had determined that Ransom should not ask, but answer questions. Their questioning was very different from the rambling, imaginative inquiries of the Harotha. They worked systematically from the geology of the earth to its present geography, and thence in turn to flora, fauna, human history, languages, politics, and arts. They were astonished at what he had to tell them of human history, of war, slavery, and prostitution. 2 things about our world particularly stuck in their minds. One was the extraordinary degree to which problems of lifting and carrying things absorbed our energy. The other was the fact that we had only one kind of hanau,
man as distinct from the beasts. They thought this must have far-reaching effects in the narrowing of sympathies and even of thought.
Your thought must be at the mercy of your blood, said the old Sorn, for you cannot compare it with thoughts that float on a different blood.
Early next day, Ransom again took his seat on Orgray's shoulder. For more than an hour, they travelled through the same bright wilderness. Far to the north, the sky was luminous with a cloud-like mass of dull red or ochre. It was very large and drove furiously westward about 10 miles above the waste. Ransom, who had yet seen no cloud in the Malacandrian sky, asked what it was. A Sorn told him it was sand, caught up from the great northern deserts by the winds of that terrible country. It was often thus carried, sometimes at a height of 17 miles, to fall again, perhaps in a handramit, as a choking and blinding dust storm. The sight of it moving with menace in the naked sky served to remind Ransom that they were indeed on the outside of Malacandra, no longer dwelling in a world, but crawling the surface of a strange planet. At last the clouds seemed to drop and burst far on the western horizon, where a glow remained visible until a turn of the valley hid all that region from his view. What lay before him looked at first strangely like an earthly landscape, a landscape of grey downland ridges rising and falling like waves of the sea. Far beyond, cliffs and spires of the familiar green rock rose against the dark blue sky. A moment later, he saw that what he had taken for downlands was but the ridged and furrowed surface of a blue-grey valley mist, a mist which would not appear a mist at all when they descended into the Handramit. Eventually, they stood on the edge of such a slope as by earthly standards would rather be called a precipice. Down and down to this face, to where it vanished in the purple blush of vegetation, ran their road. Ransom refused absolutely to make the descent on Orgray's shoulder. The Sorn, though it did not fully understand his objection, stooped for him to dismount and proceeded with that same skating and forward-sloping motion to go down before him. Ransom followed, using gladly but stiffly his numb legs. The beauty of this new Handramit as it opened before him took his breath away. He knew before his guide told him that this was Meldalorn. He did not know what he had expected, but he had not looked for anything quite so classic, so virginal as this bright grove, lying so still, so secret in its coloured valley, soaring with inimitable grace so many 100 feet into the wintry sunlight. At every step of his descent, the comparative warmth of the valley came up to him more deliciously. They had conquered the Harandra, and were on the threshold of Meldalorn. A short walk brought them into a kind of forest ride, a broad avenue running straight as an arrow through the purple stems to where the vivid blue of the lake danced at the end of it. There they found a gong and a hammer hung on a pillar of stone. These objects were all richly decorated, and the gong and hammer were of a greenish-blue metal which Ransom did not recognize. Orgray struck the gong. An excitement was rising in Ransom's mind which almost prevented him from examining as coolly as he wished the ornamentation of the stone. It was partly pictorial, partly pure decoration. Pure line drawings, as bare as the prehistoric pictures of reindeer on Earth, alternated with patches of design as close and intricate as Norse or Celtic jewellery. Ransom was just beginning to find out that the pictures, though stylized, were obviously intended to tell a story when Orgray interrupted him. A ship had put out from the island shore of Meldalorn. As it came towards them, Ransom's heart warmed to see that it was paddled by a Haroth. The creature brought its boat up to the shore where they were waiting, stared at Ransom, and then looked inquiringly at Orgray.
You may well wonder at this, Harinha, said the Sorn, for you have never seen anything like it. It is called Rensoom, and has come through heaven from Thalcandra.
It is welcome, Orgray, said the Haroth politely. Is it coming to Oyasa?
He has sent for it.
And for you also, Orgray.
Oyasa has not called me. If you will take Rensoom over the water, I will go back to my tower.
The Haroth indicated that Ransom should enter the boat. He attempted to express his thanks to the Sorn, and after a moment's consideration, unstrapped his wristwatch and offered it to him. It was the only thing he had which seemed a suitable present for a Sorn. He had no difficulty in making Orgray understand its purpose, but after examining it, the giant gave it back to him a little reluctantly and said,
This gift ought to be given to a Pithiltrig. It rejoices my heart, but they would make more of it. You are likely to meet some of the busy people in Meldalorn. Give it to them. As for its use, do you people not know, except by looking at this thing, how much of the day has worn?
I believe there are beasts that have a sort of knowledge of that, said Ransom, but our Hanau have lost it. After this, his farewell to the Sorn was made, and he embarked. To be once more in a boat and with a harass, to feel the warmth of water on his face and to see a blue sky above him, was almost like coming home. He took off his cap and leaned back luxuriously in the bows, plying his escort with questions. He learned that his own procedure on arriving in Meldalorn must be to go where he liked and do what he pleased until Oyasa called for him. It might be an hour or several days before this happened. He would find huts near the landing place where he could sleep if necessary and where food would be given to him. And now the ship touched land. Ransom rose while the harass was making fast and looked about him. Close to the little harbour which they had entered and to the left were low buildings of stone, the first he had seen in Malacandra, and fires were burning. There, the harass told him, he could find food and shelter. The rest of the island seemed desolate and its smooth slopes empty up to the grove that crowned them, where, again, he saw stonework. But this appeared to be neither temple nor house in the human sense, but a broad avenue of monoliths, a much larger Stonehenge, stately, empty, and vanishing over the crest of the hill into the pale shadow of the flower trunks. All was solitude. But as he gazed upon it, he seemed to hear, against the background of morning silence, a faint, continual agitation of silvery sound. Hardly a sound at all, if you attended to it, and yet impossible to ignore. "The island is full of Eldilla," said the harass in a hushed voice. Ransom went ashore. As though half expecting some obstacle, he took a few hesitant paces forward and stopped, and then went on again in the same fashion. Though the ground weed was unusually soft and rich, and his feet made no noise upon it, Ransom felt an impulse to walk on tiptoes. All his movements became gentle and sedate. The width of water about this island made the air warmer than any had yet breathed in Malacandra. The climate was almost that of a warm earthly day in late September, a day that is warm but with a hint of frost to come. The sense of awe which was increasing upon him deterred him from approaching the crown of the hill, the grove and the avenue of standing stones. Ransom ceased ascending about halfway up the hill and began walking to his right, keeping a constant distance from the shore. If the air had not been calm and the ground weed too short and firm to move in the wind, he would have said that a faint breeze was playing with it, and working such slight alterations in the shading as it does in a cornfield on the earth. Like the silvery noises in the air, these footsteps of light were shy of observation. Where he looked hardest, they were least to be seen. On the edges of his field of vision, they came crowding as though a complex arrangement of them were there in progress. To attend to any one of them was to make it invisible, and the minute brightness seemed often to have just left the spot where his eyes fell. Ransom had no doubt that he was seeing, as much as he ever would see, the Eldilla. He felt tired and thought that in this favoured land it would be warm enough to rest out of doors. He sat down and closed his eyes for a moment. Then he opened them again and noticed buildings below him, and over the lake he saw a boat approaching. Recognition suddenly came to him. That was the ferry, and these buildings were the guest house beside the harbour. He had walked all round the island. A certain disappointment succeeded this discovery. When he rose and looked more closely at the guest house, he saw a considerable stir of creatures about it, and while he was watching, he saw that a full load of passengers was landing from the ferry boat. In the lake he saw moving objects which he did not at first identify, but which turned out to be Sorns up to their middles in the water, and obviously wading to Meldalorn from the mainland. There were about 10 of them. For some reason or other, the island was receiving an influx of visitors. His reluctance to meet these fellow wanderers, who seemed to confine themselves to the coast of the island, drove him half-consciously upwards and inwards. He found himself at last on the fringes of the grove and looking straight up the monolithic avenue. He had intended, for no very clearly defined reason, not to enter it, but he fell to studying the stone nearest to him, which was richly sculptured on all its 4 sides, and after that curiosity led him on from stone to stone. These pictures were very puzzling. Side by side with representations of Sorns and Harassa,
and what he supposed to be Pfiffeltriggy. There occurred again and again an upright, wavy figure with only the suggestion of a face and with wings. The wings were perfectly recognizable, and this puzzled him very much. Could it be that the traditions of Malacandrian art went back to that earlier geological and biological era when, as Orgray had told him, there was life, including bird life, on the Harandra? The answer of the stones seemed to be yes. He saw pictures of the old red forests with unmistakable birds flying among them, and many other creatures that he did not know. On another stone, many of these were represented lying dead, and a fantastic Hanakra-like figure, presumably symbolizing the cold, was depicted in the sky above them, shooting at them with darts. Creatures still alive were crowding round the winged, wavy figure, which he took to be Oyasa.